The year is 1962. The world is split in two. The Cold War is more than a standoff, it's a global chessboard, with every move shadowed by nuclear fear. On one side, the United States, a capitalist superpower defending its influence across the Western Hemisphere. On the other, the Soviet Union, expanding its reach through communism, proxy wars, and ideology. And between them sits a small island nation, Cuba, thrust into the heart of this high-stakes game. Just a few years earlier, Fidel Castro was a revolutionary outsider. He rose up against Fulgencio Batista, Cuba's military-backed dictator whose regime was deeply tied to U.S. interests and riddled with corruption and inequality. Batista had suspended elections and silenced dissent. While foreign investors, especially from the U.S., profited, the average Cuban lived in poverty. In 1959, Castro's guerrilla army marched into Havana. Batista fled. The revolution had won. At first, the United States recognized the new government. But when Castro nationalized U.S. businesses, redistributed land, and began radical reforms, Washington grew uneasy. Castro didn't immediately declare himself a communist. He spoke of sovereignty, dignity, and breaking from imperialism. But as U.S. hostility grew, economic sanctions, diplomatic pressure, even assassination plots, Castro found an ally in the Soviet Union. For the Soviets, Cuba was a strategic prize, a socialist state just 90 miles from Florida. For Castro, aligning with Moscow was both practical and symbolic, a shield against American aggression, and a new model of revolution for Latin America. By late 1961, Castro openly declared Cuba a Marxist-Leninist state. To Washington, the Cuban Revolution was no longer just a domestic matter, it was a threat. In April 1961, the CIA backed a covert invasion of Cuba by 1,400 anti-Castro exiles. The goal, spark an uprising and topple the government. But at Playa Girón, known today as the Bay of Pigs, the plan collapsed. Cuban forces quickly overwhelmed the attackers. The local population did not rise up. And the world saw through the U.S. denial of involvement. For President John F. Kennedy, it was a moment of deep embarrassment. For Castro, it was validation and justification to tighten alliances with the Soviets. In the wake of that failed invasion, U.S. military leaders were determined not to fail again. If they couldn't provoke Cuba into a war, what if they provoked America into one instead? The next move on the Cold War chessboard would come not from Havana or Moscow, but from within the Pentagon itself. In the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs disaster, frustration simmered within the U.S. national security establishment. The CIA had failed to remove Castro. Diplomatic efforts were going nowhere. And Cuba, now openly aligned with the Soviet Union, was rapidly becoming a fortified outpost of communism, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida.
It is clear that the forces of communism are not to be underestimated in Cuba or anywhere else in the world. The advantages of a police state, its use of mass terror and arrest to prevent the spread of free dissent, cannot be overlooked by those who expect the fall of every fanatic tyrant. If the self-discipline of the free cannot match the iron discipline of the mailed fist in economic, political, scientific, and all the other kinds of struggle as well as the military, then the peril of freedom will continue to rise.
To many in Washington, this wasn't just a foreign policy problem. It was a humiliation, a dangerous one. The pressure to act mounted. But another direct invasion was politically risky, and public support for a new conflict was weak. That's when a small group of top military officials proposed something radical. In March 1962, the U.S. Department of Defense presented Operation Northwoods, a top-secret plan devised by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, America's highest-ranking military leaders. The plan's goal? To fabricate a series of violent incidents and blame them on the Cuban government. The intended outcome? Justify a full-scale U.S. invasion of Cuba, with the American public and international allies demanding it. The Northwoods document, now declassified, is stark in its language and scope. It proposed a series of false flag operations, military and civilian targets struck not by foreign enemies, but orchestrated from within. Now you must be wondering, what was in the plan? Among the proposed actions, staging a fake attack on the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay, including faked casualties. Blowing up a U.S. ship in Cuban waters, echoing, "Remember the Maine" incident that helped start the Spanish-American War. Hijacking commercial airliners, replacing them mid-flight with drones, then faking their destruction over the ocean and blaming it on Cuba. Orchestrating bombings in U.S. cities and framing Cuban operatives. Even creating mock funerals for fictional victims to stir outrage. These weren't theoretical exercises. The plan was fully outlined, with details on logistics, timing, and how the media could be manipulated to ensure maximum emotional impact. To the generals involved, this wasn't madness. It was cold strategic calculus. They believed that a manipulated public outcry was the only way to legitimize direct military action, especially after the Bay of Pigs had exposed the limits of covert intervention. If they could convince Americans that Cuba had struck first, political resistance would vanish. Congress would be forced to act. And Castro's government could be toppled swiftly. It was a drastic plan, but it came shockingly close to becoming reality. All it needed was the president's signature. Before we go into more details, please make sure to like and subscribe to this channel. When President John F. Kennedy was presented with Operation Northwoods in early 1962, it marked a critical turning point in the Cold War, and in the relationship between the military and civilian leadership in the United States. The plan landed on his desk through General Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. On paper, it offered what the military saw as a clean solution. Fabricate a Cuban attack. Justify an invasion. Eliminate Castro. No more uncertainty. No more waiting. But Kennedy's response was clear and immediate. He said no. Kennedy wasn't naive about the threat Cuba posed in the Cold War context. He had already faced global embarrassment at the Bay of Pigs, and he knew the stakes were high. But staging attacks on American soil, killing civilians, or lying to the public to start a war, that crossed a moral line. Kennedy rejected the Northwoods proposal outright, deeply disturbed by how far his own military advisors were willing to go. He understood something fundamental. Democracies cannot survive when truth becomes a weapon of manipulation. Shortly afterward, he began to distrust the Joint Chiefs, especially Lemnitzer, whose aggressive stance on Cuba and advocacy for preemptive war worried Kennedy and his inner circle. By the end of 1962, Lemnitzer was reassigned to NATO. He would no longer serve as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. This wasn't an isolated disagreement. It was part of a larger pattern. Throughout his presidency, Kennedy increasingly found himself at odds with the Pentagon and intelligence agencies, many of whom pushed for direct military interventions, not just in Cuba, but in Vietnam and beyond. Operation Northwoods was a symptom of that deeper divide. A military leadership steeped in Cold War urgency, versus a president trying to avoid nuclear escalation and hold. What would have happened if Kennedy had approved Northwoods? It's a question historians still wrestle with. Would Americans have believed the staged attacks? Would Congress have declared war on Cuba? Would the Soviet Union have retaliated? There are no answers, only the sobering fact that a plan to manipulate public opinion through deception and violence was seriously considered at the highest levels of American power. Kennedy's refusal was a quiet, but powerful act of restraint. He chose diplomacy over deception, accountability over expediency. And in doing so, he stopped one of the darkest proposals in U.S. military history from becoming. Operation Northwoods was rejected, but it wasn't discarded entirely. After President Kennedy shut it down, the proposal was quietly filed away, buried within the archives of the Pentagon and lost to time. Its authors, including General Lyman Lemnitzer, faced no public scrutiny, no hearings, no consequences. The American people never knew the plan existed. And for more than 30 years, Operation Northwoods remained a secret, tucked away behind government seals, classified as top secret. But history has a way of resurfacing. In the early 1990s, following the public outcry over the secrecy surrounding President Kennedy's assassination, the U.S. Congress created the Assassination Records Review Board, a body tasked with declassifying documents related to the events of that era. Among the tens of thousands of pages reviewed and released, was Operation Northwoods. In 1997, journalist James Bamford, author of Body of Secrets, was among the first to spotlight the plan. The revelation stunned the public and even many historians. Here was proof, in black and white, that U.S. military leaders had once proposed acts of terrorism against their own country to provoke a war. Operation Northwoods quickly became a case study, used in classrooms, cited in documentaries, and debated in political circles. Some viewed it as an outlier, a Cold War artifact born of desperation and paranoia. Others saw it as a warning that even democratic institutions can drift into darkness when fear and ideology override principles. Crucially, the document didn't represent a lone actor or rogue department. It was endorsed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military body in the United States. And that raised a much deeper question. How many other plans, unexecuted and unseen, remain hidden in classified archives? Operation Northwoods was never carried out, but the mere fact that it was conceived, documented, and presented to the president tells us something essential. Even in democracies, especially during times of fear, the boundaries of ethics can bend. Governments often face complex, high-stakes decisions. But national security, when unchecked, can become a justification for actions that would otherwise be unthinkable. Northwoods showed how, under the weight of Cold War paranoia, military leaders believed that lying to the public, even endangering them, was a viable path to strategic success. They weren't acting out of madness or malice. They were acting out of ideological certainty, the belief that they defeat communism and justified manufacturing of a war. That mindset isn't locked in the past. We've seen echoes of it in controversies over intelligence manipulation, misinformation in times of conflict, and policies enacted during national emergencies. Operation Northwoods isn't just a story about the United States. It's a universal warning. Across the world, authoritarian regimes, and even elected governments, have used fabricated threats to justify crackdowns, surveillance, and war. What Northwoods teaches us is that no system is immune. Free societies require more than elections and constitutions. They require public vigilance, independent media, and the courage to challenge power, even when it wears a uniform or waves a flag. In today's world of social media, deep fakes, and disinformation, the possibility of engineered narratives is even more potent. What happens when the tools once imagined in Northwoods, fake attacks, fake evidence, emotional manipulation, are no longer just possible, but easy? And what happens when governments can act in the shadows, confident the truth may never come to light? Operation Northwoods serves as a case study, one that asks us to stay informed, ask questions, and demand accountability. Because while the plan was shelved, the impulse behind it still echoes in the halls of power. And the next time a government tells its people, we must go to war, history reminds us to ask, why? Operation Northwoods was never executed. But the fact that it was even proposed raises serious questions about trust, power, and the lengths governments will go to during times of fear. Now we'd like to hear from you. Was Operation Northwoods a necessary evil, or a dangerous betrayal? Do you think something like this could happen today? And should we be more skeptical of official narratives in times of conflict? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you found this eye-opening, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, stay sharp, and stay questioning.